cannot be awake in America these days and not be thinking about leadership. Americans turned out in record numbers at the polls a few weeks ago and voted in significant number of outlying candidates, sending the message that maybe it's time for something new. We're watching every day, perhaps one of the most destructive, unhealthy American presidents prance around the international stage, wreaking havoc that is quite literally killing people. And we're learning the hard way what we should have known all along. The ends do not justify the means. True leadership is not exercised by abusing power and hoarding resources and insisting that we're first. Because of all these things, I don't know if Pope Pius XI did us any favors in 1925 when he added this special day to the Church's liturgical calendar. Today is Christ the King Sunday, or Reign of Christ Sunday, intended by the Pope to remind us that Jesus is King, not governments, or political systems, or social structures, or societal trends. The problem for us comes when we connect our human ideas of leadership with God's idea of leadership and conflate the two. They are two completely different things, and when we assign the qualities of human leaders to God and vice versa, some really bad things can happen as power is gained and abused by so many who just can't wait to be king. This exactly was the kind of confusion that was going on in Jerusalem in the passage you just heard this morning from John's Gospel. We customarily read this text during Holy Week, so you might be kind of scratching your head this morning. You'll recall that John, our Gospel writer, told the story of Jesus, convincing us that Jesus was a messenger of God who lived his life above the political fray, teaching us a different way. But here John is painting a different picture of Jesus. Jesus himself involved in high-stakes political engagement, quest for power colliding with quest for power, and Jesus preaching a message that is so hard to hear because it called Pilate, his followers, the people of Galilee, and it calls us to face a cold, hard truth. When we live our lives in pursuit of the power of this world, we are very far indeed from the kingdom of God. When Jesus walked the earth, the Jewish people in Jerusalem and surrounding areas were under the strict confines of Roman rule. Though they had some semblance of power to call their own councils and make basic rulings among the Jewish community, there was a Roman emperor installed as a representative of the emperor, like a governor. At this time in the history of Jerusalem, this person was Pontius Pilate. He was a genuinely well-liked ruler and easily manipulated by influential groups, including leading Jewish groups like the Sanhedrin, the ruling council. Well, the Sanhedrin did not have the power to make judicial decisions involving execution, even if the person standing trial was a Jew. They had some political pull with Pilate because they controlled the crowds. And that was Pilate's main interest, to keep the status quo, to make sure that things were running smoothly, keeping the emperor happy. So this complex political snarl is exactly where our passage picks up, in a confrontation involving political influence, organized religion, and Jesus of Nazareth, who refused to be hemmed in, constrained by the political systems that ran everyone else's lives, or bullied into using violence to gain political power. Because of Jesus' unwillingness to conform, the community leadership found themselves desperately needing to get rid of him. He was preaching a message that began to make the constructs on which their power rested seem a little wobbly. The people who were listening to Jesus were beginning to question traditional authority. They started to wonder about the regulations of the temple that were meant to keep people in check. And they started to buy into this strange philosophy of this one who said that God was on the side of the poor, the disenfranchised, the disabled, all of those who needed God so much, and that God was not contained in the councils of prominent men and doled out little by little at their whim. It was revolutionary, and it was causing a lot of problems. But because of politics, the Sanhedrin had to engage the Roman governor and have him take care of the situation. You know what they say, politics makes strange bedfellows. And so it was that the most prominent community leaders of the day came to the palace to talk with Pilate. They couldn't actually go inside because that would violate their religious cleanliness. So what we heard today is a chain of events, which is quite humorous, in which Jesus of Nazareth, arrested at the insistence of the community leadership, was facing examination by Pilate in his inner sanctum. And the community leaders, hoping to get Jesus executed, could not attend the trial in the palace for religious principle. So imagine Pilate, Roman governor of all Judea, running back and forth like a messenger between Jesus in his courtroom and the community leaders waiting outside, who are trying everything they could to convince him to execute. Finally, by the time we get to today's passage, Pilate has had enough. Running inside after consulting the leaders outside, Pilate asked Jesus with not a little exasperation, "So, are you the king of the Jews?" Trying to keep peace in Jerusalem during Passover, Pilate just wanted this taken care of. If Jesus said out loud, "I am the king of the Jews," the case would be cut and dried. Pilate could give those leaders what they wanted, and this mess could be cleaned up so they could go on with the festivities. But Jesus wasn't making it easy, because what Pilate was calling a king, and what Jesus was calling a king, and what Jesus came to teach us about leadership were two different things: apples and oranges. Jesus tried to explain, "I'm not the kind of king you're thinking of. If I was that kind of king, you can be sure that we'd be in the middle of a violent uprising right now. But that's not how good leaders lead. Good leaders serve the people they lead. They defend those who have no one to defend them. They help those who need help. And by so doing, they model the best way for all of us to live in community." This is precisely why the crisis of leadership we are experiencing in this country right now is so harmful. We all know, of course, power grabbing and lying and insulting people and doing whatever it takes to put yourself at the center of attention is not good leadership. But when we see our leaders behaving this way, it sends a message that it's okay for us to live that way out in the world, in the grocery store, in the workplace, in church committee meetings. And it's not okay. It is not okay to lead that way, and it is not okay to live that way. Jesus is doing in this passage exactly what he came to do, to bear witness to the truth, that true power is never found in oppressing others. It comes from lifting up those who need support and making life better for everyone, not just myself. Earlier this week, I read a story about an Anglican priest who talked about what it was like to live under apartheid and try to follow the rule of Christ instead of the government. He talked about his entire congregation being arrested, 240 members, from babies to a 90-year-old man, all put in jail for resisting the laws of apartheid. This made me think about the many times, even in just the history of this country, when those who claimed to be Christians didn't stand up to the powers that were perpetrating evil, preferring instead the safety of some skewed mix of American nationalism and Christian faith. And then I thought about those who did stand up, who paid a price at lunch counters and violent protests for voting rights and on the Underground Railroad and to protest our country's internationally violent engagements. And I saw it again on Friday, when my Twitter feed was filled with the story of several friends in Durham, North Carolina, who were arrested at an ICE office. News reports tell the story of the detention of Samuel Oliver Bruno by ICE agents who tricked him into leaving Citywell United Methodist Church, where he has been living for 11 months, while he petitions to have his deportation to Mexico delayed. Although the government can technically enter a place of worship to seize asylum seekers, it has been the tradition and practice of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement not to make arrests in sanctuaries. But on Friday, they requested that he appear in person to provide fingerprints, a necessary next step for his petition. He was accompanied to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office by members of the church, along with faith leaders in the community, and when plainclothes officers forcefully arrested him in the office, the folks who were with him stood up to defend him. They blocked a doorway with their bodies. They surrounded an ICE vehicle in a chain. They delayed their government's ability to remove him until they were arrested and taken to jail. Friends, this story happened on Friday in the United States, and it is not a far away anomaly from this very congregation. As many of you know, the Riverside Church has been part of the sanctuary movement since the 1980s. It is not a far reach for us to have to think very seriously about what we would choose to do if we were to find our own community in a similar situation. Today, on Reign of Christ Sunday, it would do us well to be very careful, because we do our faith a disservice when we confuse human authority with the reign of Christ. The kingdom that Jesus is building requires leaders who have an intense tenacity, the kind of integrity that is birthed and preserved in our very cores, and the commitment to put your life on the line to live what you say you believe. Not a protest for the sake of protesting, but a very clear understanding of whose authority it is that we will follow in the end. As you heard me say earlier, today is the final Sunday in the liturgical calendar. Next week we begin Advent and a whole new year of being the church together. In the end, I think maybe Pope Pius XI was right to ask us to reflect today on good leadership, because so much of what we see, both inside and outside the church, is not the kind of kingly behavior that Jesus came to teach us. And as we begin this new year together, it might do us good to consider each of our own contributions to this community, to think about whose rule of law we choose to follow, and to take an inventory about whether or not we are showing up in the world and living our faith with the kind of integrity and humility that Jesus modeled for us. And if you need a reminder, you can meet me out in a smelly stable in just a few weeks. Together we will peer over the edge of a mud-caked feeding trough and glimpse a helpless newborn baby who came to show us a totally different way to live and to lead.